Welcome to the Exposing Scientology podcast, where we delve into what really goes on in the world of Scientology and Scientologists, and sometimes take side journeys into other organizations that display similar traits. This week, I'm very happy to welcome someone that I have known for far too long. Makes me seem very old. She was a long-term Sea Org member at the INT base, working directly with David Miscavige. For much of the time, she was involved very directly with Scientology celebrities and the Celebrity Center. She escaped in 1998 and wrote a wonderful book called Escaping Scientology: An Insider's True Story. And I will have a link to that book on my blog post that will go up concurrently with this. Without further ado, welcome Karen Pressley. Hi, Karen.
Hi, Mike. It's good to be with you today. It's been a while.
It has been, and it's nice to talk to you. Let's start at the beginning for those. You've been on the Aftermath. You've done all sorts of media. You've done interviews with Claire. But there may be people that aren't particularly familiar with you. So let's just give a little background of your involvement in Scientology for those who may not know. So when did you first get into Scientology?
Well, I got into Scientology in the early 1980s through Peter Schless, who I was married to at the time. He had I think he had been a magnet for Scientology. He first heard about it through Chick Corea at a concert when he went backstage, and Chick extended his hand to shake it and said, "Do you know L. Ron Hubbard's works? And if you don't, I recommend that you find out about Scientology." That was Peter's first introduction. Then we were living in Houston, Texas in the late 70s, and we found out about the Purification Rundown because of a guy, a musician, of course, who used to run in front of our house wearing a black wetsuit in Houston, Texas. And we would see him out our window and think, what is that crazy guy doing in this black wetsuit? So when we went out front to find out, we invited him in the house and found out. Then he told us about the Purif and the Sweat program. So that was the second introduction. The third was Peter was working on an album for a movie called Urban Cowboy starring John Travolta and Deborah Winger. And this was also in Houston in around 1978 or 9. And Peter had found out that JT was a Scientologist. Mm-hmm. So he had all these introductions. Then we finally moved to LA in 1980-81. And we were surrounded by people we met who were in Scientology in the music world.
Right.
And so actually, it was one of Peter's roadies at the time. We moved out to LA because he got an invitation to work with Cher's band at the time called Black Rose. Les Dudek was her guitar player. He used to play with the Allman Brothers, but he was Peter's old friend from Florida. And anyway, they had roadies to move the equipment for the concerts. And one of the roadies was named Bob Fisher, who talked to Peter about Scientology. So it seemed to be around us, like everywhere.
Yeah.
And so we got involved at the Valley Org before we got into the Celebrity Center. So we went to the CC, I think around 1982, right around the time when our song On the Wings of Love was hitting on the radio that Peter co-wrote with Jeffrey Osborne. So that song success, gave us an open invitation to come into the Celebrity Center. And, the rest of the story is history. That's where we got hooked.
Right. Yeah, you were a big catch. I mean, seriously, Scientology is very, very oriented towards trying to attract celebrities, and someone with a huge hit song like On the Wings of Love is a big get for Scientology. And so I'm not surprised that you were welcomed with open arms and love bombed. And so what actually what got you started? Like, how did you get going? Did you do the Purif first? Did you do intro courses? What happened?
Well, we actually got into, we met a field auditor at the time who was running a practice out of his home. And well, it's Bob Fisher and another friend of his, Jerry Simons, who told us about communication courses. Basically, it was intro courses.
Mm-hmm.
And when we found out about communication, I was very, very interested in improving our communication skills because Peter and I moved out to LA to really make it in our careers. And making it in your career is all about your communication skills.
Right.
Expressing yourselves as artists, expressing yourselves as a designer, as a musician, relationships with other people, the ability to promote yourself, etc. And so communication was very appealing to us. So that's the first thing we did. We took a communication course. And as a result of that, I started reading other books that Scientology offered, such as Science of Survival. And it was that book that lured me into Scientology because of what Hubbard talks about regarding the role of the artist in society.
Right.
That was the hook. I didn't care about religion. I really didn't care about auditing or becoming an auditor. It was the artist's role in society was 100% the hook. And I believe it was for Peter as well.
Well, I certainly understand that. That makes a lot of sense. I just so everybody understands, while Peter was a star, celebrity musician, you also were a fashion designer, and it wasn't just like you were Peter's sidekick. You had your own thing going. And, Peter is one of the most brilliant musicians I have ever come across. Like in the end, I spent a lot of time working with him on events and that sort of stuff that we won't even get into. But he was a genius, and still is probably, if he hasn't been beaten to a pulp by now.
Right.
And you had your own career, and you were a celebrity in your own right. So the two of you together are like catnip for celebrity stuff.
Mike, I appreciate you saying that because in the course of telling my story over all these years, it's been natural for me to talk about Peter. And actually, that's one of the reasons why I will eventually rewrite my book, because my book is really about our love story and how we were lured in, but it focuses a lot on him instead of on me.
Right.
And it's my story, which tells you what my state of mind was at that time.
Yes.
Because I was a designer in my own right. I was building up my design portfolio. I think one of my first celebrity clients was Lisa Blount, who co-starred on Officer and a Gentleman. I had a client who was on the Carol Burnett show. I had numerous people like that were not A-list celebrities yet, but people who were achieving success in their career, and I was designing for them. And I started to design stage clothes for the Mr. Band, of course, Peter, and all of his performances with Cher and Melissa Manchester, and et cetera, et cetera. So thank you for bringing up that point up, because that was who I was.
Well, Karen, also it's kind of important for people to understand that as to where you ended up.
Yeah.
Like, how did you end up doing what you ended up doing? And
right.
Your background and your talent is what led you there. So I just want to ask you one thing. You talked about the impact of Science of Survival, but you were now hooked up with whoever this field auditor was and Celebrity Center. What was your initial impression of Scientology? What did you think about all of this?
It hit me on so many different levels, Mike. As a religion, it made no sense to me. I had been raised a Catholic, and where you're taught that you were born with original sin and you were a sinner, you had no choice. And then you come into Scientology, and all of a sudden now everything about you is good and you have no sin. And, it's all about building you up as an individual. So that was kind of appealing to me, but very confusing in the way they went about presenting it.
Right.
And then as an organization, it was, like I said, it struck me on so many levels because it was so confusing the way it was set up. But despite all that, I was intrigued by how one could become basically one's own God.
Right.
Because Scientology, especially Celebrity Center, it caused you to be pretty much drunk with your own self-importance, or at least anybody who walked into CC, who started to take courses, and who was treated by the organization, focused on your self-importance. Of course, Scientology, for me, in my world, was all about the artist. Like I said, I wasn't interested in the other things as much.
Mm-hmm.
But it was like an intravenous drip of being told that I was a special breed of Thetan, that as an artist, I was in the top strata of earthly beings, that we possessed more theta or life force than any other people. And that really put you in kind of a godlike role.
Yes.
And then here you are in this select community where if you're a celebrity of sorts, you're allowed to come into this place and be treated with kid gloves, like on a silver platter. And when you're in Los Angeles and you're competing in the entertainment business, Celebrity Center was an oasis. It was a refuge. It was a safe place where you could be and you could be protected no matter what you did. And that, let me just comment right now that ties into the whole Danny Masterson trial. I couldn't have been happier in what was exposed about Scientology's Celebrity Center than what came out during the Masterson trial, where it became so obvious how celebrities were protected and covered up. No matter what you did, you were taken care of, and they would do anything to protect you.
Right.
And that is exactly what it was like the day we walked in the door and ever since. And that's exactly why that protective bubble is so important for Scientology to maintain, because it's all one big deception.
Yep. I think that there is another aspect to that too, Karen, which is, at least back in those days, being at Celebrity Center, also, you mentioned the communication being so important for artists and celebrities, also contacts. And there is this little world of Scientology celebrities that are sort of rub each other's backs and, well, I'll introduce you to this guy and, my agent blah, and I'm doing a film and you could get a bit part in it and start your career.
That is no lie. That is 100% true. That is the network. That is the network. And it has such a power. It has such a power. It shapes your world. Right. And you don't dare burst that bubble.
Exactly. That's exactly right. Okay, so how long did it take before you guys joined the Sea Org?
Well, let's see. We got in, like I said, CC around 1982. I signed a Sea Org contract actually right before LRH died. He died in 86.
Right.
I signed a contract right before that. Peter did not want me to join the Sea Org, actually. Interesting. We were, by that point, by 1986, we had completely shucked our personal life. And we had a house at the top of Coldwater Canyon with 3,000 square feet with a view of the San Fernando Valley and a jacuzzi that seated 12. And we had a recording studio in there.
Wow.
We got rid of all that and we moved into the Manor Hotel. Now, ask me what sense that makes. And so the first place we lived was a room on the 6th floor until one of the suites opened up on the 7th. And we moved up there, where we lived for about a year or two until I routed into the Sea Org. But it was also around that time that Peter started going up to Gold to work on I think it was the Road to Freedom album.
Yes, probably.
And Ron Miscavige was Peter's recruiter. Ron took it upon himself to transition Peter to become a gold musician, but it was actually David Miscavige who invited Peter to join the Sea Org, which was very interesting because Peter had taken LSD and wasn't qualified.
Right.
But David Miscavige said, well, your production record is so awesome. You know, we're going to waive this rule about LSD. So I had already routed into the Sea Org, and actually it was around 1987 when Peter won the Religious Freedom Medal,
right,
as a disseminator. Well, prior to that, here's the deal. You know, you were talking about, well, me in my own right, what I was accomplishing as a designer, as an artist. What happened was I sort of transformed my creative skills into pouring it into the Celebrity Center. And I was all into the arts. And I started organizations called Artists for a New Civilization. And I had 16 groups of artists. We had musicians, designers, songwriters, actors, dancers, you name it. And I held an event at CC called Artists for a New Civilization. It was like late 86, 87, somewhere around there. And that's what I was into, the revitalization of the arts. And we were just pouring people into Celebrity Center at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was my thing. I was working with Packwell Terry and Axioms, and we were doing events, and we were having jazz night in the dining room and things like this. But the whole point of that is we were doing everything we could to bring people into Scientology.
Right.
And that was how we got into recruiting artists and celebrities, was that through that avenue. Peter set up a studio in the Manor downstairs, and we would have musicians and singers and writers come in and work down there. And then that's partly why Peter won the Dissemination Award, or the Religious Freedom Medal. He won the medal in 87. It was during my event at the Artists for New Civilization when I first met David Miscavige. So that had to be early 87. When he came down from the Int base, and I didn't know who he was or the Int execs, but who came with him was Greg Wilhare, Ray Midoff, and Guillaume Lesev.
Mm-hmm.
So they all came down to the party. And I will never forget this because I got bills for cases of wine, $90 bottles of wine, none of which we ordered for our party. And I found out that it was David Miscavige's entourage that had this wine. But that was the first time I met him, and also Ray Midoff and Guillaume Lesev. And at that time, I was a brand new Sea Org member, but I was an executive at CC. So the next time I met David Miscavige was actually at the IAS event in the Eiffel Tower in Paris. The event was held at a hotel in Paris, but then the after party was in the Eiffel Tower. And that is where I met David Miscavige when he had all the winners. I think it was Peter and someone else. Might have been Andrik Shapers.
Yes, I think it was that year.
That year. But that's when I met my first encounters with those Int execs. Interesting that Guillaume Lesev ended up becoming my senior when I got to the Int base, when I was in the IMPR office, Int Management PR office. And Ray Midoff ended up working in the hall across from me in Del Sol as senior CSN. So that was a very interesting entry for me into the Sea Org and getting a taste of what the insane Int base was like.
Yeah. Well, that wasn't much of a taste of the insanity yet, but
no.
What did you think of Miscavige when you first met him?
Well, when I very first met him, I don't think we actually exchanged words. We exchanged glances. And I found him, my initial impression of him was that he was a cold, icy, heartless individual. And how could he be the leader of Scientology? That was actually my first thought. But Mike, I was never allowed to share that opinion because...
No kidding.
You know, and I didn't even have words with the man. It
Right.
was just my initial impression. I felt that way partly because he never even greeted me, and I was the wife of one of the awardees. Whereas Guillaume Lesèvre came up to me and shook my hand and vigorously said how great it was to meet me, and just a vast difference between the two of them.
Yes. No.
And then, of course, when I finally got to the Int base, well, the rest is history, and we could talk for hours about that.
Well, we will touch upon that briefly because I certainly want to hear your thoughts. You have a wonderful expression in your book that you sort of summarize the Int base as, quote, rationalizing the obscene into the palatable. And
Yes.
that has always stuck with me. Since the first time I read it, I went, okay, that's perfect. That is summarizing the Int base in like half a sentence. So
Thank you.
what did you find most obscene? We don't need to go through the entire history of every post and thing that you held there.
Yeah.
Suffice to say that you ended up, well, you said you were in the international management PR office.
Mhm.
You worked on events. You ended up overseeing the design of uniforms
Mhm.
for all Scientology organizations. You worked directly with David Miscavige on many of these things, both the
And
events
Shelley. And
and
Shelley.
and
Mhm.
Shelley, and
Mhm.
I want to ask you about both of them. But
Okay.
what did you find most obscene?
It begins with my arrival at the Int base in the 1990s. Well, I got up there about 1990, and I was shocked at first of all, the deception of the picture that was painted about the Int base. And then the over the rainbow thing. And then I thought it was obscene when the first moment I arrived at the base was in the evening. And I pulled up to the garage, which was at the time on the outside of the base, where there was a single light bulb hanging in front of the garage. And it was illuminating the barbed wire that was sitting on top of the chain link fences. That was all I could see down Highway 79. It was like I felt that I had arrived at a prison camp.
Well, you had.
And I had. And I had. And so the obscenity of that was that vision and how I betrayed my own instinct. First of all, that they kept the barbed wire on the fences. I was told by Kevin, who greeted me, to keep people out, when my gut was telling me this is to keep people in.
Right.
And I was freaked out about arriving. And everything, my instincts were 100% correct, but I denied my instincts. And that was, of course, my downfall. But the obscenities just continued. That was number one. Then I see how the staff were treated. The insanity of it was the beauty within inside the buildings, sometimes very, very good food served to us. Meanwhile, no one was ever sleeping. We were verbally abused regularly by David Miscavige and other seniors who he abused.
Right.
So the abused, it was a trickle down. He would abuse seniors and they would abuse people below them, and that environment. So the whole environment was obscenely dehumanizing, degraded, and debasement. So the obscenities all relate to the physical abuse, the enforced abortions, the enforced divorces to prove loyalty to David Miscavige, the attacks on executives. I can't tell you how many times I've been in a lineup, including with you, where people were pushed and shoved or screamed at or clobbered or whatever. The punishments, the levels of punishments, issuing cards to the staff and then to have quote unquote rights and privileges, and then pulling those cards if you make a mistake, or to the point where you're not even allowed to go to your room. You have to sleep on the floor and not take showers. And eat rice and beans in the mess hall. Of course, there's the RPF, and that's a whole story in itself. So I have to tell you, this rationalizing the obscene into the palatable was a mindset that a Sea Org member had to adapt to in order to survive.
Yes.
You're standing there observing all these atrocities, and you have to convert your reaction to that into a smile on your face.
Mm-hmm.
And no reaction. You can't react to it. You can't speak back. You can't question it. You can't object. It's just, yes, sir, and no case on post and no backflash. So that's rationalizing the obscene into the palatable. It's the process of creating a world that you could live in within that obscene world.
Yep. Yeah, it's a perfect description, Karen. And, the more distance I have from that time at the int base, the more I recognize, and having, studied a lot of things subsequently and read a lot of books and listened to podcasts and this and that, just what sort of the extent of the mind control that is employed, and the underpinning of it all is that there isn't a single person on the int base, except perhaps David Miscavige, even though he doesn't go there anymore, who ever had an adequate amount of sleep. Not a person.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like, you want to talk about Peter. I watched Peter stay up for like 4 days in a row trying to compose music on some kooky deadline of, you have to have this up the hill to COB in the next hour.
Right.
And as the days wore on, he became slower and slower and slower and less capable. I mean,
less capable.
You can't walk across the street properly, let alone create art, if you are in a state of mental fog. And everybody at the int base was in a perpetual state of mental fog.
Yes.
And you become susceptible, you become pliable, you become controllable. I've read so much about the absolute vital importance of being well rested.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the absolute opposite for everybody on that base.
Yes.
All the time.
Yes, all the time. It was modus operandi. I mean, that was probably the most obscene thing that existed. And you weren't allowed to question it. You were expected to be your best and do your best, whether you had slept for a week or not.
Right.
And, and then you were punished if you didn't perform at your optimum on no sleep.
Right.
I mean, how many mistakes had been made at int events where the cameramen or the lighting people or the sound guys hadn't slept in days? Think about the big event, the War is Over event.
Yep.
Remember the disasters that happened at that event?
Yes, I do.
Those people hadn't slept
for
days.
Days and days and days. I know. And that happened basically every event.
Every event, especially like I was in the int management public relations office, and we were scripting the talks.
Right.
And we would dread it because there were 7 major events a year. And we lived on this like clockwork. And we knew when we were going to be able to sleep and when we weren't, which was mostly not. And being married to Peter was, it was horrible for myself to experience all this, but it was a double whammy because for him, he was for weeks prior to the event, not sleeping, writing music for videos. And honestly, Mike, Peter truly lost himself. He really became another person. And that had a lot to do with how we ended up having such different views about whether to stay or whether to go.
Right. I totally understand.
That's a whole. I just want to add that, the concept of rationalizing the obscene into the palatable. I actually, and you probably know this, but I just for the listeners, that came from a line in the show House of Cards, which was a fabulous show some years ago.
Yep.
And, the president, who was played by Kevin Spacey, wasn't it?
Yep.
He was asked a question by his attorney general. Is this how you live with yourself? By rationalizing the obscene into the palatable. And that just set it off for me. It explained it.
Yep.
It explained it. It explained what we went through. And I actually want to create another parallel at this moment. I've been watching a show called The Tattooist of Auschwitz. Have you seen this?
No.
It's on Prime. It's unbelievable. I recommend everybody to watch this thing who has ever been in the Sea Org, because this is a show. It's called The Tattooist of Auschwitz. This show is a story about how Jews were slowly conditioned to become non-persons and treated as vermin. But the show starts out with a guy who has to go. Every Jewish family was supposed to send one person from the family to this work camp, but they had no idea what they were walking into. But the reason I recommend it is because this show is a parallel to what we went through in the Sea Org. Now, obviously, Scientologists or the Sea Org was not like capturing Jewish people and murdering them
Right.
en masse. But the parallels are distinct in terms of how they got people to do what they wanted them to do.
Right.
But the worst part of it, Mike, was in the show that it was almost triggering for me to watch this, how once they were sent into the camps, so you could compare that to being in the Sea Org in general at the base or being on the RPF. But you compare it to standing there and watching someone get abused, beat to death, raped, and you're standing there watching this and doing nothing about it.
Mm-hmm.
Because they couldn't. If
Right.
they objected to it, they would be shot or beaten themselves.
Right.
And I have so many memories, Mike, of standing there watching things happen as if my hands were tied and allowing it to continue.
Oh, Karen, we all do.
Yeah.
We all do. It's very easy for people to say, oh, well, Miscavige is just a little guy. Why didn't one of you guys turn around and just take him out? And it's a logical question unless you have been in that environment.
Exactly.
And at that point, it becomes a ridiculous question.
Yes.
You go, are you kidding me? Are you joking with that question? And the two realities are so opposite one another. It's the reality of being in that world and the reality of being out of that world are so diametrically opposed.
Absolutely.
It's hard to explain to the out part of the world what it was like in the in part of the world, and what thoughts go through your head, and how, at least for me, and I suspect for you and many other people, you look back and you go, how is it possible that I was that stupid, that brainwashed, that
indoctrinated,
that weak, that pathetic, that spineless? And you just have to go, well, when you put the whole picture together, it's very understandable. And probably the most valuable thing to me since leaving or escaping has been the interaction with others who were similarly located and went through similar experiences, because you start to realize that this wasn't just your failing, and you weren't crazy, and you weren't just a pathetic, spineless blob of nothingness, that everybody had that same indoctrination and that same mindset that was hammered into them and hammered into them and hammered in over this no sleep always.
Yes.
And this, it beats you down eventually and it wears you out. But there is also one thing that is interesting, which is when I look around and I go, okay, but people have escaped. You escaped. I escaped. Mark and Claire escaped. Tom DeVocht escaped. A lot of people have escaped.
Mm-hmm.
Why? How? What's different? And I sort of come down to this kind of a concept. I'm not quite sure how to articulate it, but I'm interested in your perspective on it.
Mm-hmm.
Like what you see as the common denominator of those who have managed to escape from the int base. Almost every one of those people that I've named in some way or another was a bit of an individual and a bit of a rebel and a bit of a
nonconformist, kind of.
Yeah,
maybe?
a nonconformist or a streak of nonconformity that never could get beaten out of them.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually that sort of streak or ember that remained got flared up, and they finally went, I know eventually I finally went, okay, better off dead than this. I don't want to do this anymore. I'm not doing this anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, kill me. I don't really care. That's it. I'm done. And I'm sort of curious about what your perspective on that is, and what your mindset was when you escaped.
Well, that's a great question. I think about this quote that I read in some of my readings after I got out. I was like you. I was an avid reader of books and theories and everything to try to learn about myself, to learn about others, to learn what happened, which I'll talk about that when I talk about going to college. But one of the quotes that I ran across, which comes to mind as you asked me this, that is said, if you're afraid to speak out against tyranny, you become a slave to it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, speaking for myself and Peter, what was the difference between Peter and me? Because I was the nonconformist. I was a rebel ever since I got to the int base. Even when I was at CC, I had to do what I felt was right. And I guess not all of me was overtaken by the mind control. But I think it's a process of radicalization. To what degree are you able to be radicalized? And in my book, I wrote a whole chapter about radicalization and how it happens very slowly and gradually.
Mm-hmm.
But there's something in my DNA which was very different than Peter's, because Peter was always afraid to speak out about what was happening to him.
Right.
And I wasn't.
Right.
That's why I escaped the first time in 1990. Then I went to the RPF. Then I am back for 2 more years, and I escaped again in 1993. It was like, fuck this. I'm not going to be treated this way. And the only reason I came back both those times was because I wasn't trying to leave my husband or get out of my marriage. I just wanted out of the Sea Org. I wanted out of the obscene life that we lived.
Right.
But I remember on one particular trip, and I think this is what defined the difference between Peter and me. Peter and I were at the int base about 9 years. We got to take a leave of absence. We went to a family reunion. And I will never forget this in my life. We rented a car. We were driving up the highway into the Smoky Mountains. And it was raining. We were in a convertible. And it was just, I was seeing this as like, oh my God, we're free. This is life. I want this back. And I talked to Peter at that time about leaving.
Mm-hmm.
We need to leave the Sea Org. We need to get our life back. We need to recapture who we are. And I saw him in his mind entertain it for a moment. And the first thing that came out of his mouth was, no fucking way. I am so afraid of Marty Rathbun coming after me with an e-meter.
Oh my God.
That's what Peter said. And I'm like, wow, I could care less if Marty Rathbun came after me with an e-meter. And yet he was like almost trembling in fear just at the thought of mentally entertaining it.
Right.
What was it? Was it cowardice? You know, I often, after that time, I often thought that Peter acted very cowardly. But why did he act cowardly? Why was he so afraid to take a risk to save his soul? I was not, obviously. I escaped twice before I finally escaped the third time, and he stayed.
Right.
So is it cowardice? But I know that I was very different in that sense from him, in that I was the risk taker. I was the risk taker. I would always entertain wild ass ideas to do things, places to go, things to do. Yeah, that was the difference. I hope I'm expressing an answer to your question there, but
it's a wonderful answer. This is pretty difficult things to put into words, even.
yes,
Like, even when you have the opportunity to sit down and write, and you're not having to like just come up with a sentence right now, but you can think about it and put it down. Even then, when I was writing about this sort of stuff in my book, it was the hardest things to explain and the hardest concepts to communicate, because it's so intertwined with your sort of inherent, for lack of a better word, use the Scientology word, beingness.
yes,
It's like who you are as a person and what you are as a person and what has impact on you and what has impact on someone else. And while you may be able to explain your own personal views, which can be very hard to do, it's really hard to project yourself onto someone else and go, well, this is why they did or didn't do what they did.
yeah,
And
I agree.
like you say, lack of courage. Yeah, maybe. I don't know. It may be that the sleep deprivation that Peter has undergone. I mean, when I think of a person with sleep deprivation at the int base, I think of Peter.
Wow.
He
Wow.
and Gary Weesey are the two people that I think of when I think no sleep.
Wow.
And they were the people that were involved very directly in the events every time, and were the, quote, only people that could do a particular thing that was vital to those events. Gary Weesey was the only person that was trusted to edit the videos, and Peter was the only person that had the ability to score videos.
Right.
So those two, Gary Weesey, and for anybody that doesn't know who we're talking about, he has been around at the in base of Scientology since it first started. Like, in fact, he was the first person at Gilman Hot Springs sent from La Quinta to establish that base.
Wow.
And he is someone who is perpetually in trouble with Miscavige, but Miscavige always comes back to him because he's the only person that could do the job that he had to do. And he was a very, very accomplished guy before he joined the Sea Org. He was an engineer and a pilot, and he's no wimp.
He was intelligent. He was creative. And he could mastermind a complete and total edit that nobody else could do.
Absolutely. And he was strong. I mean, strong physically and strong emotionally. And there is someone that I have often thought, okay, how come Gary Weesey is still there? with the abuse that he has taken, how is he still there? He is such a strong-willed, fundamentally strong-willed person. But he's also one of the people who has had the least amount of sleep of anybody in the history of the international base. And I believe that that has something to do with it. And I believe that that plays a role in everything and everybody's decision-making and will and what they have left in their tank. And, so I don't really know. And I've sort of sidetracked off into something I didn't even really want to talk about.
But it's significant. It's very significant. And I think it's interesting that you're thinking of Gary Weese and Peter Schless as you referred to Peter as a musical genius, which I agreed. Interesting that Gary and Peter became targets for such treatment by David Miscavige because they were at the top of their game. And I mean, look at you. You were quite a masterminder yourself. And look at the target you became.
Yeah. Yep.
And the level of radicalization that happened with such capable people, capable, intelligent people, were so radicalized. And I think that radicalization ties in with the whole, rationalizing the palatable and rationalizing the obscene into the palatable.
Yep, absolutely. So you finally escaped for the third time and final permanent time in like 1998, right?
Yes, 98.
Okay.
Yeah.
Where did you go?
The third time I actually, that was a whole story that I've covered in my book. I flew to Atlanta.
Right.
To join my family.
Right.
And that's what happened. Interesting. The guy that helped me, that's covered in my book. I won't go into that. But he was, yeah. So when I got to Atlanta, there was no Scientology in my family's world. None.
Right.
Atlanta.
You're fortunate.
Yes. And that had a lot to do with my ability to recover. Because I took a very big step, a very radical step, unlike a lot of people. I decided to completely purge Scientology from myself.
Mm-hmm.
I stopped using the language. Of course, I didn't hang out with, I had no Scientology people around to hang out with.
Right.
But this helped me to recover. And this is also where I went to college. I had always wanted to get a real education.
Mm-hmm.
But the reason education was so important to me, and I didn't really know it until I started to get into it, Mike, when I started to go to classes, and I'm learning everything from political science to world history to English literature to sociology. Every single class I took had ties to something to do with Scientology. It explained concepts. It helped me to understand the indoctrination that I had gone through. Every book I read, every paper I wrote, every lecture I heard would address points about my past in Scientology. And I realized that I had a desperate need to get a college education so that I could put my mind back together. And I mean, I had to undo my Scientology indoctrination.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know how else to do it. I don't know how people do it unless they go through intensive therapy. But I really wanted to undo my Scientologist in me. And it was my college education that enabled me to do that.
That's incredible. And, it is often said that the biggest enemy of cults is knowledge.
Yes.
And, that is often oriented toward they don't want anybody knowing anything outside of what they tell you.
Mm-hmm.
But the converse of that is also true. The more knowledge that you manage to gather and more things that you manage to understand about life and the world and anything proofs you. And there is a term in Scientology called false data stripping, which is, getting rid of false ideas that you have. And as these things come, and I know this is what I've experienced from reading books and watching TV shows and talking to people, and you start getting a bigger, broader picture, and the little pieces of Scientology nuttiness that are embedded in your brain get suddenly sprung loose. And I don't know exactly how to describe it better than that. You
Oh,
kind of
that's
go,
it. That's what happens.
you kind of go, wait a minute. Yeah, wait, that's not exactly what it is. It's really this. And this perversion or this twisting or whatever of reality into Scientologisms is perhaps the most difficult thing to undo once you get out.
And I agree with that. And that has everything to do with why I completed a complete bachelor's degree. I can't even express, and I don't know if I express this well enough in my book, but my college education was like 5 years of therapy because I restored my mind.
Yep.
I literally was able to purge. Now, I believe that Scientologists don't have a logic at all. It's just Scientology thinking. But when you start to learn about the real world, or the real world, the world that's out there, that is actually quite amazing, that Hubbard doesn't want you to be part of. And when you start seeing truths, you can start undoing the untruths, like you just described. You're undoing the untruths, and you start to develop critical thinking skills.
Yes.
And critical thinking skills are the thing that Scientology works to destroy in Scientology training.
Absolutely correct. Despite the tagline of learn to think for yourself.
Which is on the wall of the Qual building.
I know.
This is part of the double speak of Scientology. Learn to think for yourself. Only don't think for yourself. Think as a Scientology does not make you a better person. It just makes you a better Scientologist. And so, a college education for me was my solution to undo all that. Yeah. I don't know where I would be, Mike, or what I would have done had I not done that, honestly.
Yeah. I hear you, Karen.
I want to bring up, during all that, I acquired literally hundreds of books, a lot that I had to read required through my courses, but things that I discovered as a result of taking classes. One of the books I came across, which I would strongly recommend to anybody, is called, I'm going to show it to you right here. It's called Trauma and Recovery by Judith Lewis Herman, MD. Exceptional book. This book helped me to realize that I had PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
And once I saw that I had PTSD, I was in college, so I was able to go, and I was connected to a counselor, and I actually got PTSD counseling. I mean, I don't know about you, Mike, and I can only imagine what you went through, but I was plagued with nightmares. And
Karen.
Most of my nightmares, David Miscavige was the star of the show. His face and his voice, his presence, I can't even tell you, for years. I mean, even after I married Greg, I would sometimes wake up screaming because I was afraid that I was being sucked back into the int base. It was after that I got PTSD counseling.
Karen, I think everybody who was there has had that. Like, yeah. I had nightmares for years, regularly, like every week, about the same thing. I was back at the int base somehow, trapped again. Mm-hmm. And ultimately what cured me of that was when I finally finished writing my book.
Yes.
That was a cathartic experience for
Wow.
me.
Mm-hmm.
Having to sit and go through, and I had this wonderful editor that I worked with, and she was like my therapist, basically. She would ask me, tell me what you were thinking then. What was your feelings? What was going on? And because I had originally written the manuscript, and I'm not going to repeat it because I said it in the last person that I was talking to for my podcast. It was like I wrote my manuscript as sort of like a legal document. There wasn't much emotion or feeling in it. And she spent the time to pull that out of me. And I think that is ultimately what put an end to the nightmares, literally. And I'm forever thankful for that, because
Wow.
they sucked. And it's not just you and me, believe me,
Oh, I'm
every other
aware.
person
I'm
I
aware.
have spoken to. And I say to them, that those sort of nightmares are a classic symptom of PTSD.
Mm-hmm.
It just is.
Yeah.
Anyway, I just want to get to some other things.
Yes.
We're
Yes. Yes.
already up to an hour.
Uh-huh.
I'm not going to talk about, but I might actually put on my blog some of the campaigns that were done to try, and the OSA campaigns that were run to try and dead agent you,
Yes.
and prevent you from speaking and prevent you from writing your book. And it was a pretty concerted campaign. And I put some of those documents out in other places before, and I'm going to put a couple more on this blog post that I'll do when this happened. But you sort of receded, and you mentioned that it was the Aftermath show that sort of brought you back as, okay, I've got to do or say something. So tell me about that.
Well, that's an interesting takeoff point, because, ever since I'd gotten out, I was actually, like you mentioned earlier, I did quite a bit of media. I wrote the first version of my book back in 2000, and that was stopped by OSA, etc. Then the second in 2006. But when I got onto a speaker circuit, Mike,
Yep.
I had done something like over 100 events. So I was not a protester. I was not a picketer. I was a speaker, speaking at events, and I would speak in universities and stuff like that. And then after a while, I just, like you said, I receded, because it was like, enough already. I got to build my own life here.
Right.
I don't want to be just an ex-Scientologist. I wanted to do more with my education. I wanted to develop my skills, etc. But when Aftermath came out, it just brought it to mind. Well, Leah made some points like, every person's story is important, no matter what your experiences were. No matter who you were, no matter what your experiences were, every person's story is important. And when I started seeing many people speak out, I felt like, okay, it's more safe now to talk, because there's strength in numbers.
Yep.
I mean, when I was first out, there weren't a lot of people out
Yes.
who were actually doing things, like Tori Crispin, myself, Bruce Hines, Maureen Bolstead. There were not very many people out who were doing things. And so it was very difficult. It was very challenging. I mean, the OSA office made life really miserable for anybody who was really trying to expose Scientology. But like I said, once Aftermath came out, it was like, okay, now there's going to be strength in numbers.
Yep.
There's some safety here, some protection, some people to go to share your experiences. And so that's what got me deciding, screw it, I'm going to publish my book. Because as you know very well, the first two versions of my book were stopped by OSA and really tried to screw me over, especially through Elliot Abelson, the attorney, who tried to scare me to death. But when he said, we like to win, I said, well, so do I. anyway, so what I did was I started my own book publishing company, a self-published book.
Right.
And OSA had scared 2 book publishers into not publishing my book. So I said, screw it. I'm going to do this anyway. So, but that's who I am. See, I am a rebel. I'm going to survive. That's who I was.
Right.
That was my DNA. So I finally finished the book, the 3rd version of the book, and published it. And interestingly, you had gotten out by then. And actually, I think the first time that you and I ran into each other was at Kathy Schenkelberg's play in Tampa.
Yes. Squeeze My Cans or whatever.
Yes,
It was.
Squeeze My Cans. It was around 2015, 2016, something like that.
Yep.
And I saw you for the first time since you had gotten out. And in my eyes, you're a very big, bad, scary person, but you couldn't be all bad since you did get out. That was what I thought at the time. And I loved meeting Christy.
Yeah.
And then I think it was not long after that I was ready to publish my book. And then I reached out to you and asked you to write the foreword.
Right. And that was a great honor, given the history of what had happened, on my watch in OSA, stopping it from being published twice before.
Yes.
And basically silencing you. To write the foreword was poetic justice.
You used a term in the foreword that it would be nice if you kind of shared this with listeners. You used the term Sophie's choice, that this was a shared experience that you and I had.
Mm-hmm.
If you would comment on that. Some people might not know what that means, especially to you.
I don't remember how I used that in there, but I have often referred to that as, you have to decide to give up one thing that you love or another thing that you love or that you believe you love. And you are left with this impossible choice to make of, you had a choice when you decided to leave. Am I going to abandon the husband that I love for my sanity and self-preservation? And that was the same thing that I went through of, I have to abandon my children. And when I say abandon my children, Scientology loves to say, see, he admits that he just abandoned his family. And he's the one that disconnected, and he's the one that did all this bad,
Right.
They take those words and twist them into something that it really isn't.
Yeah.
But you have a choice. My eternity, my family, my everything that I've known in life, or my sanity, and my freedom, and my sense of self-worth. And both of them are things that you shouldn't have to give up one to have the other.
Exactly.
You should be able to have both. You shouldn't have to give up one child in order to keep the other child, which is the Sophie's choice.
Right.
And I feel very empathetic to everybody that is put in that position. And truthfully, that means every single person in Scientology.
Right.
Every single person in Scientology. Worse for Sea Org members, then for staff members, then just for the regular old Scientology dudes. But every single one of them confronts that impossible choice in one way or another. And I feel bad about that. I feel sad about that. I feel like that's one of the things that people just can't ever understand unless they've been in it.
Right.
And I'm not sure if I answered your question or that.
Oh, you did.
Definitely.
Okay. It was an unfortunate, sad, shared experience.
Yes.
A very unfortunate shared experience. But back to the OSA campaigns against me. Yeah, I was in Atlanta when that happened, of course. And Yeah, OSA came after me. I was affiliated with some Christian organizations in Atlanta Community Ministries. And I also had a speakers, I belonged to a speakers bureau.
Right.
And OSA was trying to destroy my relationships with all of these people.
Right. I know.
And very interesting the way that all played out was because I had already briefed them on my experiences. So they already kind of knew what was coming. And I think to that extent, they kind of anticipated it. But once it happened, it didn't affect them one way or another. I mean, it didn't affect our relationships. The Speakers Bureau didn't drop me. The ACM didn't drop me. In fact, they strengthened my relationship with the ministry at that time. So I felt like I was surrounded by warriors, of like people who shared my thoughts, and it defended me.
I understand, and I think that those people are amazing for having done so.
Yeah.
I also know from the experiences that Leah and I have had that it becomes very difficult to justify bringing the pain to people that didn't ever sign up for that. Like, we got into the position like that with producers and people that worked on our programs who started being targeted by Scientology. And we started just feeling bad. Like, we can't put those people, they didn't ask for this. They were never Scientologists. And now they're getting crap and we feel bad about it. And it wears on you after a while. And, that's a part of the sort of relentless robotic machinery of Scientology that is so difficult to overcome and deal with, is this idea that it just never stops. It just keeps on going. And the only way to shut it down and stop it is to walk away, which is what they want, but you don't want to give them the victory of walking away. But can you keep inflicting this on people that didn't ask for it in the first place because somehow or another they're connected to you? So
I battled with that. You were asking me something earlier that attached to that. It's like, what did I do? The aftermath kind of revitalized me to get back into being an activist. And it was always a catch-22, just based on what you said. I mean, why should my husband have to suffer? He's a never-in. Why should he have to suffer for something that Scientology wants to do to me? You know what I mean? It's like, and so, to a great extent, I stopped speaking out because I guess I did reach a point where, okay, come on, I've dedicated a big part of my life to exposing Scientology. We'll let some other people carry this load now,
Yep.
But I did want to share something that I've never told anybody in the media before in terms of my own activism. And that is, after I got my bachelor's degree, I went ahead and did a master's degree. And my master's degree was in writing, English writing. And in the course of doing that, I got to be very, very close friends with several professors who I then discovered had been in a cult. One of my best friends is a former Jehovah's Witness.
Wow.
One of my other best friends, I'm talking professors at universities. Another one of my best friends had been in the family, the Children of God, that Fleetwood Mac had been in. And so, small world, they helped me to really find my voice because they already knew what I had been through. And that was an amazing experience. So after I got my master's degree, I immediately got a teaching job at a university here in Atlanta, teaching English composition. And I'll tell you, I was all about this, helping people find their voice, whether it was through speaking, through writing, through acting, whatever. We all have a voice in some way. And so my quest became to help people find their voice. And I don't know that I ever shared this with you, but I wrote this workbook called Coming to Terms with Your Story, and
Wow.
writing to heal. Because
Wow.
yes, during the course of my education, I ran across a lot of theory about writing and the healing benefits that it has. And I'm bringing this up because you mentioned that, writing your book was like therapy for you.
Yes.
Absolutely. That is what my workbook is about.
That is amazing, Karen.
And I did this as a project during that time, and I'm going to take it and develop it because I think a lot of people could benefit from it. But where I'm going with this is I got my first teaching job in 2012. I graduated with my master's in 2011. And then I was invited. So I was teaching writing, like composition, English composition. I also taught basic journalism and basic public relations writing because that's what my training was in.
Mm-hmm.
But I was invited by one of the professors from another department, interdisciplinary studies department. I was invited to teach a religious studies class because she had seen my resume on, speaking at 100 different churches and writing books and this and that. And so one of the classes that I was invited to teach was called Religion and Popular Culture. And this is a class about how popular culture shapes religion and how religion shapes popular culture. And I was able to create my own syllabus. I created the whole class, and we study. So I teach them about cults, and we use a book called, this is the book right here, Controversial New Religions. And Scientology is a chapter in this book. But I use this book so that the students learn about all different cults. So I'm not just focusing on Scientology.
Right.
But I spend 3 weeks of the semester on Scientology. And I have people, it's in the curriculum to watch Going Clear, to read or to listen to the podcast that you did with Patrick Bet-David.
Uh-huh.
They have to watch parts of the Danny Masterson trial. They have to find out about Mark Bunker in Clearwater, Florida. They learn about Valeska Paris's lawsuit, Leah Remini's lawsuit. They learned about how Lisa Marie Pressley was going to be a witness for the Danny Masterson trial. I expose all these pop culture events in this class. And so while I'm not out, protesting and picketing and doing YouTube videos,
Right.
I'm in the classroom and I am teaching people the realities about Scientology and other cults.
That is absolutely wonderful and amazing. And I had no idea. Congratulations. Great work. Maybe I'll pop into one of those classes one day.
That would be amazing.
That would be a lot of fun. Karen, I can't thank you enough. I mean, there's other stuff that we could talk about, and maybe we'll come back and revisit and have a chat at some point. We've already gone way beyond an hour, which I like to generally keep these to. I really thank you for your time. I thank you for all that you have done, for your book, for your work, for this course that you're teaching. And is there anything that I didn't ask or anything that you want to say before we close this down that you didn't have a chance to say?
Well, we were going to talk about the experience of doing the Aftermath show.
Right.
But we can save that for another time. Of course, I want to thank you for all that you've done on your own and with Leah. I mean, let's face it, you're one of the most controversial people in the ex-Scientology world. So
that would be true.
So when you called me or when you contacted me to do your podcast, I thought, okay, this could be really interesting depending on where he wants to go with this. But it's really been cool discussing shared experiences and you understanding, each of us understanding what the other went through.
Right.
Yeah, I do want to say, I guess I want to make a comment that I have stayed out of the trash and the controversy. And, I really value people sharing their opinions about what happened. But like you and I were saying, unless you were there and you were in the middle of it, people really have no idea what we mentally endured.
Mm-hmm.
And I think far be it from anyone to judge who is doing things right, who is doing things wrong after getting out of Scientology. Because for me, mine was such a personal, traumatic journey to get out and put myself back together. And everybody does it in their own way. You're doing it in your own way. Leah's doing it in her own way. Everybody's doing it in their own way.
Right.
And I just really wish that all of the X's and the never ends could express more tolerance. I don't think forgiveness is the right word, but I think tolerance and understanding, because everybody's unraveling at their own pace,
Right.
putting their lives back together. And so I hope that you keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you, Karen. And
you too. And I wish you well. I wish you physically. I know you're dealing with another challenge on top of all of that. So,
well, thank you. And I'm pretty sure that we'll talk again, because I always find these chats with people who have such intimately shared experiences to be both interesting and helpful. Every time there is another little piece that I get, or something that sort of I go, oh, that's a great way of looking at it, or I hadn't thought about it that way before, or this is something that, yeah, I never really realized. And so I enjoy this. I hope that the listeners enjoy it too, as much as I do, because I find these discussions to be very interesting and helpful. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mike.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for tuning in. You can find more episodes of Exposing Scientology wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to check out my best-selling book, A Billion Years, My Escape from a Life in the Highest Ranks of Scientology. It's available on Amazon, hardback, softback, and as an audiobook. Until next time, be well and happy.